Good evening. Back today, as I announced yesterday, and hopefully you noticed, 5:30. Oh, go away. Sorry, Facebook's just suddenly telling me the Scargatherer is live. Wants me to say whether that's useful or not useful. Well, to me it's not useful because you're interrupting me. Go away. Yeah, we were back actually in plenty of time from our appointment in town, but I didn't know whether I would be or not. I should set the record straight about my husband's attempt to replace the screen on my old phone, my broken phone, which he managed to do straight away without cracking it. The only thing he hasn't done is reconnected the fingerprint sensor. But I think that's probably just a question of him plugging it in. So I should have had more faith. Although it has to be said, the reason I was suspicious was because he has actually tried before and not managed. Anyway, here we are, chapter 5 of The Demon in the Embers. Where have we got to? Oh, Joe and Lucy are going to go into... Well, they've gone already into the city. They've set out into the city on foot, with Joe dressed up in Peter's old best clothes, just to try and make him look smart enough that he wouldn't be under threat by those people who were press ganging men to go to war, the people who picked him up earlier. So that's where we got to, and right at the end of the previous chapter, he's just noticed blood running across the cobbles, or around the cobbles, coming out from underneath a gate, and then he hears this terrible, terrible scream from behind the same gates. Let's just try and get this straight. Anyway. A terrible scream from behind the gates, and he says to Lucy, "Someone's killing someone." Chapter 5. Lucy pulled her arm away from Joe and covered her ears with her hands. "It's all right," she shouted over her shoulder as she hurried on. "It's just the sow gelder." "The what? What's he doing?" "Gelding sows." "What's that?" Joe asked when they were far enough away to uncover their ears. Too late, he realised it was probably something he ought to know. "Making it so the sows can't have piglets, of course." Lucy sounded baffled. "Why is he doing it right in the middle of town? Where else would he do it?" She looked at him. "That was a butcher's shop. There were probably 100 pigs in the yard there, and they've got to be done." Joe tried to imagine 100 pigs. It hadn't looked like a very big yard. The animals must be jammed in. "The gelders doing the ones that came in from the stocks market this morning," Lucy said. "You don't want the sows getting in pig if you're going to eat them, do you?" Joe recognised her tone, which I completely failed to do. "You don't want the sows getting in pig if you're going to eat them, do you?" Joe recognised her tone. She was starting to get suspicious about the things he didn't know. He huffed air out through his nostrils, trying vainly to clear the foul cocktail of smells. Just like the turkeys, the yard of pigs had brought the stink of the country into the city. On top of the stench from the graveyards, it made him feel quite sick. "Don't you have this sort of thing in Norwich?" Lucy asked. "Norwich is nothing like this," Joe said, thinking of the market town he'd visited once, years ago. "So you won't have anything like that either?" Joe looked up cautiously, wondering if this was a trick. But Lucy was pointing to an imposing building with stone columns and arches, and statues peering down at passers-by. "What is it?" he asked, genuinely impressed. "It's the Royal Exchange. My father does a lot of business in there. There's a big courtyard inside, with shops and drinking houses all round. Anyone who's anyone goes there." "Is your father there now?" "Quite likely, unless he's at the Mercer's Hall." "Can we go in?" She shook her head. "Children aren't allowed." They went to walk on, but their way had been blocked by 4 men in purple livery setting down a sedan chair. A small African boy, also wearing purple, ran around to the side nearest them and stood to attention as the curtain was drawn back. A lady in a sumptuous dress and a towering wig stepped out. Her face had been painted white with red cheeks. It looked brittle, like a mask. A crescent moon and a cluster of stars had been stencilled in black onto one cheekbone, and Jo could swear her eyebrows had been stuck on. They looked thicker than they ought to be, and weirdly furry. Ignoring the boy and her 4 servants, the lady strutted to the entrance of the Royal Exchange with a spaniel wedged under her arm. The boy scurried in behind her. "He's going in," Jo muttered to Lucy. "He's younger than us." "That's different," she whispered. She sounded awestruck. "That's Lady Elizabeth Howell. The boy is her slave. He goes everywhere with her." The boy disappeared. The liveried servants picked up the empty sedan and carried it off. Jo felt a twinge of envy at the richness of their uniforms, and at the slave boy being able to go inside where he and Lucy could not. But of course it was Lady Elizabeth who lived in luxury, not her servants. Being a slave here was unlikely to be any better than being a slave in Roman times. It occurred to Jo that this was the first time he'd seen a black face in Lucy's world since Fishbourne. Did that mean that the slave trade had begun? He had no idea. Lucy let out a sigh. "How amazing to see her," she said dreamily. "I've heard so much about her." "I thought she looked pretty strange," Jo said. "What had she done to her eyebrows?" "All the great ladies do that." The corner of Lucy's mouth twitched. "They get rid of their own eyebrows and stick on new ones made of mouse skin." She wrinkled her nose. "It must be horrible, actually." "What, chopping up mice? I'm sure it is." "No," she laughed. "Getting rid of your own eyebrows. The hair remover is made with cat poo and vinegar." "Oh, no." Jo shuddered. "Well, it's either that or puppy dog water." "Made with puppies?" Jo could hardly believe his ears. "That's right," Lucy said with relish. "Roast puppy dog, mixed with a pound of earthworms washed in white wine." Jo remembered the hair dye at Fishbourne made with leeches rotted in red wine. "I'm glad they included the wine in the recipe," he said sarcastically. "That makes anything work." "Does it?" Lucy's face was a picture of innocence. He shrugged. "I don't know. I don't think so." They walked on without speaking for a few moments. Then Jo remembered something. "You were just saying about hair remover," he said. "I saw a carriage with a bald coachman today when I arrived earlier. Why wasn't he wearing a hat, or at least a wig?" Lucy's eyes lit up again. "What colour livery was he wearing? Was there a crest on the coach?" "He was in red and black, I think, but I didn't notice a crest." She looked disappointed. "Red and black are quite common," she said. "If you didn't see an insignia, we won't be able to work out who it was. They must be rich, though. Only really wealthy people have bald coachmen. It's a way of making sure that everyone knows that somebody important is in the carriage." Jo grinned. How funny that a bald coach driver might have the same purpose in Lucy's world as a supercar in his own time. On their left, they came to a large, open area whose roof was held up by giant oak posts. A smell of fish lingered in the air. Hold on a minute. Oh, I've set my phone up differently and I'm not quite as comfortable as I usually am. There we go. You'd think after 55 readings I'd get this right. On their left, they came to a large, open area whose roof was held up by giant oak posts. A smell of fish lingered in the air. "This is the stocks market," Lucy said. Jo chuckled at his own misunderstanding. She'd mentioned the pigs coming from here earlier, but he'd been imagining the stock market in his own world, where traders in suits shouted at banks of screens. A couple of women were haggling over some meat or fish, and there was one pen of cattle. But most of the stalls had closed for the day. "What's that building over there?" Jo asked, looking at a grand Tudor house on their right. "That's the General Letter Office," Lucy said, "though my father says you shouldn't use it for anything private. They read everything that goes through." Jo tried to imagine Royal Mail doing that. It would be so boring and pointless. Come on. Lucy tugged Joe's sleeve. I want to show you the Mercer's Hall. It's just at the end of Poultry. That's the name of this street. Chickens and geese used to be sold here, although it's mostly taverns now. Joe held back a smile. Lucy must have decided he was stupid to feel that she had to explain that. You couldn't fail to see that these houses were taverns. They were doing a roaring trade for a mid-afternoon, judging by the singing and lurching around of the people outside them. A little further along, they came to a junction where several streets met. The road they were on broadened here, and there was another church and a handful of houses beyond, standing in the middle of the thoroughfare like a kind of island. With so much more sky visible here than where they'd been walking before, Joe was struck by the grey cloud that hung in the air. Chimneys poked up from every roof, most of them belching smoke in spite of the heat. Nonetheless, people strolled in couples or small groups among the carriages and carts, apparently enjoying the summer weather. In front of Joe and Lucy was a squat stone building with battlements. Quite a few market stalls had been set up nearby, and there were a lot of people milling around. "That's the Great Conduit," Lucy said, before Joe had even asked. "Quite a few of the trades draw their water from there, and people whose houses don't get water piped from the new river. It's where the water sellers get their water as well." "Do people have to pay for it?" "Oh, yes," she said, then with less certainty. "At least, I think so. The trades do, anyway." They walked on until they came to an astonishing wooden building. "This is it, the Mercer's Hall," Lucy said. "Isn't it fabulous?" Joe gazed up at it. "It's amazing." The columns which supported the building were carved like totem poles, with extraordinary creatures and gargoyles painted all sorts of bright colours. Between them were panels decorated with vivid geometric patterns, and thousands of glittering panes of glass made up the windows all along the front of every floor of the 5-storey building. Joe couldn't remember ever seeing a building like it in his own time, but of course that was because most of the wooden buildings from the past had either fallen down or burnt to the ground, especially in London because of the fire. A pit opened up in his stomach. The Great Fire of London. They'd learnt about it at school, the way all the houses had been built of wood, and the fire had spread because they were so close together. He looked around anxiously. The place where they were standing now was fairly wide, but every other street had been narrow. He tried to remember what else he'd learned. It had happened in 1666, he knew that for certain. There was the Battle of Hastings in 1066 and the Great Fire of London in 1666, and hadn't it followed the Great Plague the year before? He gulped and looked at the buildings nearby to see if any of them had dates. But of course that wouldn't help. Most of these had probably been built over the last 100 years. Unless he could find one being built right now, with a stone saying 1666, he still couldn't be sure. "Shall we carry on down Cheapside to St. Paul's?" Lucy asked. "If you like." Joe was distracted. "We don't have to, if you'd rather not," she said. "It's half ruined anyway. They're still arguing over the rebuilding." Joe frowned. Hadn't St. Paul's had to be rebuilt after the Great Fire? If the fire hadn't happened yet, why did it need rebuilding already? Or had the fire already happened years ago? But that was impossible. He was sure that after the fire the roads had been made wider and the houses had been rebuilt in stone. They'd been ordered to be flat-fronted too, without the upper stories sticking out, to stop something like that ever happening again. No, this was London before the fire, quite definitely. "The spire of St. Paul's was struck by lightning 100 years ago," Lucy was saying. "Charles I had just finished repairing it when he was executed. After that it was desecrated." Her voice dropped to a scandalised whisper. "Oliver Cromwell's men even stabled horses in there." "That's terrible," Joe said. "You know what?" Lucy lit up with enthusiasm. "Let's go down to the river and find a boat. I can take you up the Thames out of the city. I'll show you the palaces of Whitehall and Westminster, and we'll go and see Oliver Cromwell's head." "His head?" Joe echoed. It's on a spike above Westminster Hall, along with the heads of Bradshaw and Ireton. Spotting Joe's incomprehension before he could cover it, she explained patiently, when King Charles came back to the throne, he had the men who'd killed his father dug up out of their tombs and hanged. But I thought he was dead. Not King Charles II. It was his father who was executed, Charles I. Again she looked at him, puzzled by his ignorance. So Charles II decided to hang men who were dead already. They were traitors, Lucy said. The king had to make an example of them. They'd been buried in Westminster Abbey like heroes, so he had their bodies dug up and hanged to make it plain that they were no better than common criminals. Joe made a mental note to brush up on kings and queens of England when he got home. Listening to Lucy talking about Oliver Cromwell and two kings called Charles was like looking at pieces of a jigsaw without the picture. If only he knew his history. But the bits he knew best were the times where he'd met Lucy before. None of that was any use to him now. Do the heads still look like heads? He asked, fascinated. I mean, do they still have skin and hair and things? I haven't seen them in ages, Lucy said, and of course they've been up there for over 5 years now. But last time I went you could see the skulls quite clearly, with just a few wisps of black flesh. She shivered. You know, they usually soak the heads of traitors in brine before they put them up, to stop the birds from pecking their eyes out. But of course Cromwell's eyes were already gone by the time they dug him up. That's revolting, Joe exclaimed. You don't want to see him, then? Lucy was crestfallen. Well, Joe hesitated. He knew he did want to see it, but he didn't like to say so. His parents always told him and Sam off for ghoulishness if they commented on ambulances or car crashes. On the other hand, this was his chance to be the only person alive to have seen Oliver Cromwell's head on a pole. It was too good to miss. Let's go down to the river and see if we can find a boat first, he said. Your father did say there weren't any. All right, she clapped her hands. We'll go along here a bit, then down Bow Lane. If we cut through, I think it'll bring us out between Dowler's Dock and Queenhithe, but not too close to either. Why would it matter? Because they might have docked some of the ships there if they're filling with pressed men. I don't want to lose you after I persuaded my mother to let us out. If you lose me, I'm in trouble anyway, Joe said. I've no idea where your house is. She paused. You're right. I should have told you when we came out, just in case we get separated. It's on Threadneedle Street. What number is it? Number? You know, house number. I don't think I'd recognise it. Lucy looked mystified. Houses don't have numbers, do they? Ours is the one with the golden pheasant sign. Oh, yes, I meant to ask you about that, Joe said. Why does it have that? It's not a shop, is it? Still, she frowned. Lots of houses have signs. I thought it was like that everywhere. They don't have to mean anything. I think my father liked the picture, because you see it embroidered on Chinese silk sometimes. But really it's there to help people describe where they're going. I should think half the people in London know the house with the golden pheasant. But some of these signs must mean something. Joe pointed up at the sign hanging high up on the wall of the building in front of them. Of course, Lucy said, that row of coffins. Don't tell me, he interrupted. It's a coffin maker. Yes, I'm not a complete idiot. And the bag of nails on the sign back there was for someone who makes nails. Not just nails, an ironmonger, Lucy corrected him. But I saw one earlier with an elephant on it, Joe said. Clearly that shop doesn't sell elephants. No, ivory, she laughed. It sells combs and things like that. All right then, what about that one over there with the cupid and the flaming torch? That's a glazier. How would I know that from the sign? Joe grumbled. Because the coat of arms of the Worshipful Company of Glaziers and Painters of Glass has 2 cupids holding torches on it. She sounded smug. Oh, that's not very obvious, is it? Maybe not, she conceded. And I saw another one with Adam and Eve, he said. Do they sell snakes or apples? apples and other fruit. You're getting the hang of it. She smiled encouragingly at him, as though he was a small child. Joe snorted. What about the one I saw with a unicorn and a dragon then? Or was that just a private house? No, that was an apothecary. He makes remedies for illnesses. Not out of unicorn's horns, surely? Lucy nodded. It has magical properties, didn't you know? But Lucy, Joe cried in exasperation, you were with me when we had to rescue a unicorn's horn back in Viking times. And it wasn't from a unicorn at all. Your father told you that. They don't exist. Lucy gaped at him. She stopped walking and backed away a little. I don't know what you're talking about, she said. There was fear in her voice. I've never met you before, and unicorns do exist. They don't. Yes, they do. Joe took a deep breath. Never mind about unicorns, it's the rest of it that's more important. There's something I need to tell you, but before I do, just tell me, what date is it today? She pressed her lips together. It's Wednesday the 4th of July, she replied warily. Yes, but what year? As he asked, Joe remembered that in the last world they'd used some other system for counting years. He hoped he would understand her answer. It's 1666, she said. We knew that already, of course, because we know what this book's about. You can tell from the front. London, fire. It's going to be 1666, isn't it? I'm sure you knew that, but Joe didn't, because of course he doesn't have all the cues that we have. He doesn't know what's going to happen to him, or what's going to happen to her either, come to that. So he didn't realise, but now he knows. 1666. Okay, so that's it for another week. On Monday I will be back with chapter 6. So we've got 2 weeks and a day to finish this book, which will take us through to sort of late June, I suppose. I've slightly lost the plot, not really counting anymore what day it is. Rather difficult to keep count, although I need to take some care because one of my sons has his 9th birthday in the middle of June, and if I fail to take note of that, I'll be in the doghouse. So I'll be back on Monday, chapter 6 on Monday. I hope to see some of you then.